All right. So before we left for our break, we talked about function scope and we finished talking about all of our different data types, which ones are mutable, which ones are not, conditional statements. But now let's take it a step further. And to take it a step further, I'm going to go ahead and start off by talking about something called destructuring. So this is our intermediate JavaScript portion or our advanced JavaScript portion, right? How exactly do we do on this whole destructuring concept, and what is it that it works like? So in order to talk about this, I'm going to go back to our object explanation here, where we talked about object.entries. So if you remember, object.entries actually returns, oh, I apologize. I actually pushed our notes and probably forgot to remind everybody that our notes have been pushed. Uh, so in case you were wondering, our notes are pushed. And this is the third day. There you go. All right, clear. And now let's go ahead and run node example.js. All right, so there we can see node, and it's returning an array of arrays. And we talked about object.entries and how to iterate through an array. Well, we figured out that the for in loop gives me all of the keys, and that's useful. It's useful to a specific extent, right? Let me go ahead and change this for array. And let me change this bottom one down here as well for array. All right. Well, now when I execute this, I can see that, oh, I apologize. And I meant to do of and object.entries. There you go. Now let's run that. All right, so now we can see that first it returns our array of arrays. And then on the second portion, it returns each individual array on its own. All right. Now, this is great, and it gives me an array. I can assign it to individual keys, but this seems to be a little repetitive per se, right? It's not something that I necessarily want. So let's take a look at how we're doing this. Currently, I can say, hey, I want to grab a key and a value. I can put let to the left of those to ensure that these are variables. And I can console.log each one of them separately. All right. But there's got to be an easier way to do this. Right? There's got to be some way that I can grab these individual concepts out of that array. Well, let's go ahead and do this. What happens if I do something along the lines of let key, comma, value be equal to array? So we're still going to see the array console.logging, but then I'm wondering what's going to happen here on line 59. Well, now on line 59, it seems like when I try to grab key comma value out of my array, it's not necessarily destructuring properly, right? It's kind of understanding what it is that I want to do, but not all the way. So there's got to be an easier way to break this down, or to tell it, hey, this is actually an array that I'm trying to destructure. I know there is two keys inside of it, and I want to grab these concepts. Well, now if we try to run it again, we can see that we were able to assign a variable for key and value that is equal to the index 0 and index 1 of array. All right, I am grabbing the array that's put all together and creating individual variables. So now that's useful. Let's go ahead and clean this up. Now that I know that information, instead of iterating through the array itself, I can say, hey, let key, comma, value of objects.entries. And now I can console.log either my key or my value when I go through the loop as if it were working in a normal manner. All I'm doing is destructuring that array to grab the independent value from within it. Does anyone have any questions regarding destructuring of arrays? All right, seems like,
Could
oh, go ahead, Brandon.
Could we actually, could we do, never mind. Sorry. I was
Uh,
thinking something else.
okay. All right. Well, if the question populates back up, you can go ahead and ask it and we can talk about it. But now let's talk about the structuring of the object itself, right? So right now we were destructuring an array. Now I want to do destructure of an object. So currently my object seems like employee, name, age, shoes. Well, if I were to pass this into some sort of function, or I had to utilize this over and over again, it would be really annoying if I had to say, well, I want to grab employee dot age and employee dot attribute over and over again, rather than just calling the attribute itself. So how do I fix that? Well, in order to fix that, I can grab the attributes that I need. So I can say const, and let's say I only need my name and age out of my employee. I can say, well, all I want is my name and the age out of employee. And I can make that equal to the employee object itself. Well, now when I go to console.log name, ooh, seems like I get a strike through. Let's see what's going on there. No question was marked as deprecated. Well, let me try it out. Let's see what this is actually going to do here. All right, so it seems like it's working. I'm not exactly sure why my JS extension is trying to tell me that this doesn't work. It might not be recognizing that I'm doing some object destructuring. But this is just
That's because name is a reserved word in JavaScript.
Ah, got it. Thank you so much. I appreciate it, Mikhail. So let's try a different one. Let's try shoes instead. There you go. Yeah, good catch. So if I pass it through, we can see that we can grab the independent values of my actual employee. Now, this is super useful because, again, it's going to save me a lot of typing time whenever I'm working with individual objects. So now let's take a look at some practical application of this and why this would be super useful whenever we're working with web development, right? Well, if we're taking a look at our API here, we can see that we get a massive amount of information from this API, which is super useful and great. But I don't necessarily need all of this, right? If I was just trying to make, let's say, a Pokemon card, and all I need is, images and maybe 4 moves, then the rest of this information is pretty much useless to me. And for me to have to iterate through it over and over again, or have to type the same thing over and over again of Pokemon dot this whenever I'm working with an object, I could just destructure it and grab the individual attributes that I need and then utilize those in my program. All right. So that pretty much covers destructuring. At this point, does anyone have any questions regarding destructure?
Can you just go through those two things just real quick, like a quick summary, just so like
Yeah, definitely. Those two things, by those two things, I'm assuming is destructuring of an array and destructuring of an object.
yeah, just a real quick run through of what you did. Like, doesn't need to
Yeah.
be detailed.
Let's go ahead and do this again. Let's do Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. Right, so there we can see that I have an array, I have one object. Rather than just going through this entire array and specifying what each individual object should be named, or grabbing things out of the array, I can represent the array in different independent variables. So I can say let, and I can maybe do Mon, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. And I can make that equal to my array. When I do this and I console.log any one of these variables that I just established, such as Tuesday, what I'm going to get in my console will be a T. So there we can see a T, and that T is happening because Tuesday is representing the second index of my array. All right, so there I'm destructuring an array. I'm basically establishing a variable for each one of the indexes within my array.
What if we only wanted Tuesday and Thursday of that array? Cause
Alright.
it looks like you're trying to do every single one. What if we wanna specify?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, what if I just wanted to index individual places, right? Well, if I wanted to index individual places, and at this point, I may have to do a little bit of research myself, or we could try it out. But let's try it out first and see what we get here. So if I were to make an assumption, I would say that if I do partials here, and I try to do Monday and Tuesday, it would only represent the left and right hand side. So I'm assuming that if I wanted to do something that didn't fill in that specific space,
Like
I'm
maybe
going-
setting it equal to index, so like, you could try Thurs equals, 3?
I believe you could do empty commas, so you could do let, comma, space, comma, so if you just don't put anything in there.
yeah, let's try that. Let's do, so there's Monday, Tuesday, and let's say I just wanted Thursday, right? So there's Wednesday, and this should be Thursday. So let's see if that does the trick. And, oh, yep.
Cool.
that did the trick. Looks like I could just do empty commas, and I'm just putting that TU to confirm that it's the correct one. So I could utilize empty commas to skip spaces, but it is always gonna go from left to right.
Okay.
Awesome, that's a great question, Brendan. All right, so now we learn how to do partials and utilize our destructuring for arrays. But what about destructuring for an object? Well, again, here's my object. We have our employee, and it has a certain amount of attributes such as name, age, shoes, and profession. I don't necessarily want all of them. Sometimes I may just want specific attributes out of that one object. So I could grab age, and I could grab profession. And I could just say, I want these specific keys out of my employee. And when I go to console.log, the profession attribute, we can see that a console.logs the profession out of my object, which was eating. And then we'll do the same thing if I wanted to do age. All right, did that answer your question, Gary?
Yes, thank you.
Of course.
Hey, Francisco, I had a quick question.
Yeah, of course.
I was just a little confused. Could you go scroll down maybe like line 65 or 70? Yeah, so line 63 to 68 there. So for let key value, is that an array or is that like a key value pair, like a dictionary or a list?
Yeah, that's a great question. Let's go ahead and move this information from here, right up here, so we can see it next to our object. All right, so first our object is, key value pairs, but objects aren't iterable, right? Instead, what I want to see is something that's iterable. So what I'm utilizing is I'm utilizing this function named object.entries. When I do so, it turns my object into an array of arrays. All right, so because I have an array of arrays, when I do this iteration here, and I do this for loop, I can destructure each individual array within. All right, so here what I'm saying is, I know that I'm going to have an array of 2 when I iterate through this object.entries. Instead of grabbing each one individually, I want you to grab the key and the value. All right, I'm already setting variables for them. So when I console.log value, it already knows that it's supposed to console.log the second index of that array. Or excuse me, for index 1 of that array. And that's how we can see Francisco, 12, Noel, and eating. Does that answer your question, Ellerjon?
Oh yeah, that answered my question. Thanks.
Of course. Cody, do you have a question?
Sorry, yeah, that was my question that I asked on that one.
Oh, okay, perfect.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So going back to the object destructuring. So when you did the, what do you call this one? Call the key value to just pick what key that you are trying to like get from the beginning. When you do the curly braces and then you just added the age and then the profession.
Yeah,
Yeah, so when you call the profession, let's say you have more than one object inside an object, would it call all profession in those like all of the objects?
more than one object inside of the object. So you're saying, like, if I had something such as child, and then child also has profession, and the child's profession is to survive, right?
Yes.
Something like this, and then I passed it, would it call this profession as well?
Yes.
All right, yeah, let's take a look at that. Let me go ahead and move that up here, and let me again console.log this profession. So when I do this, it should only show eating, and it doesn't show any of the children, and that's because it's nested, right? This is grabbing from the employees. It's paying attention to the keys of the employee, none of its children or any other nested structure. So when I call profession, it's expecting employee at the very top level to have a key of profession. All right, it doesn't. There's another, I mean, it does right here on line 52. There's another profession that's nested, but it doesn't care about that because it never goes into the child. Now, if I were to add something like child, I could console.log my child, and that would show me my specific child object. And I could utilize object destructuring again, right? I could say const, and maybe all I want to grab is the profession. And maybe I want to name this, oh, well, that would cause an issue, right? And I make this child. Well, now we can see that it's causing an issue. I would have to figure out a way to separate these two as far as scope so that they don't override each other. Does that answer your question?
Yes. But the other thing is that what if it's not like it's not nested? They're just two objects inside. So like there's another name, Earl Jan, and then like age in a different object. Would it pull my age as well or my profession?
So something like this.
No, so like inside the employee object. So like two objects inside the object. You can do that, correct? Can you?
Nested objects is what he's talking about, yeah.
No,
Well,
not
that's what I
I think it
showed.
would be out of scope.
So are you saying to put another profession key?
no. So like I'm talking about like, can you add two objects inside an object? Or would you need to have an array inside the object to add to more than one object?
Yeah, so what you're talking about, if it's not a nested, what you're talking about is an array. So if I say like let employees be equal to, and then I have an array, then I could have multiple objects that are supposed to represent each individual employee.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Of course. All right. So now we've covered this material, we can go ahead and move on to our spread operator. Now, our spread operator is, how do I specify this? Let's see. The spread operator doesn't actually manipulate the original data structure, but it actually creates a copy. And it's really useful because it allows us to maneuver some of the data within it. So let's talk about this. All right. I currently have, oh, where did my array go? Where did you go? Come back. Come back. There you are. All right. So I currently have my array here that's supposed to represent Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. I see some messages here on the Zoom chat. Just a friendly reminder, everyone, if you have any questions, please post them on the X-Ray Slack channel. That's going to be what I'm mainly looking at. All right. So again, we have my array. What can I do with my array? Well, let's say that I want to do something like, I want to console.log a copy of my array, all right? Well, let's console.log, and if I do my array, we'll see the actual array populated in our console. Now, if I do the spread operator, and I add it on, well, we're still going to get the same exact behavior. So what's the actual difference, right? Why am I even worrying about the spread operator if it's not bringing me any different functionality or different behavior that's really obvious? Well, again, when I utilize the spread operator, it's not alternating the original data type, it's creating a copy. So let's talk about what that means. Let's say I want to utilize the spread operator, and actually I'll show it here first. We're going to go ahead and use the spread to open up my array. And then I'm going to add another element to this array. And in this case, to make things simple, I'm going to add that employee object to the array. Well, I'm going to run this code. And now we can see Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday with the addition of my employee object. I didn't use the .push method. It just added it towards the end. So what's the difference between .push and utilizing my spread operator? Well, let's see what happens when I console log my array into the console. All right, so the first one is utilizing my spread operator to push it or to add this into the index. Again, it's creating a copy. So it's saying, hey, I'm going to create a brand new array. That's this brackets on the outside. It's going to have all of the same elements as this original array. So those are my first 5 elements there. And I'm going to add an additional element at the end with the object. I'm creating a brand new array here. I'm just grabbing these, making a copy, and then extending it. When I utilize the .push function, so let me comment that out. And I say my array.push, and I pass in employee, well, that's actually mutating the original array. One of them makes a copy and creates an entirely new array, which is the spread operator, while .push is mutating the original array. Does anyone have any questions about the difference of the spread operator in an array versus push?
Yeah, does array or does the spread operator iterate over the array?
Yeah, it's a great question.
So like if I had spread inside of a for loop, would that make it more complex, like a nested kind of thing?
That's a great question. So when you utilize the spread operator, it under the hood, it's actually going through each one and creating a brand new array to also add a new one. So it is essentially doing exactly that. It is iterating through. You won't see it, and it shouldn't affect your efficiency to the point where it's something vital.
Okay.
And yeah, without going into more complexity, that's pretty much the answer. Does that answer your question there, Brandon?
Yeah, and then is that all there is to spread, or are there like other? Can you do other things with spread? Like, I don't know, add like a flag of some sort to change its behavior?
Ah, got it. So there is a little bit more functionality that you can do with spread operators. We're not going to cover that just yet. We're going to cover it once we get into React. Once we get into React, this is going to become very vital. All right.
Can you push it to a different spot, or is it always to the end when you push?
Ah, got it. So let's see. Can I push it to a different spot, or is it always going to be to the end? Well, again, I'm creating a copy. So let's see what it does. I'm going to go ahead and comment this stuff out. Oh, probably want my array to come back. And let's say that I want employee to be at the beginning. So I'm going to put employee at the beginning. And when I run my program, well, now employee is at the beginning, and then the copy of my array comes afterwards. So it could either be the start or the end. You don't really have the ability to put it in the middle or in between, but you could do the start or end. Does that answer your question? All right, see the thumbs up. Perfect. let's go ahead and move on into our objects and how the spread operator works with objects. All right, well, just like in an object, I can go ahead and say, I want to create an object. I already have my employee, right? Well, what if I want to extend my employee, all right? What if I just want my employee to not only have, oh man, here's my employee. I'm gonna make a copy of it and bring it down for simplicity's sake, just that we can visualize it. Let employee, yep, tracking. All right, so there we have our employee. I have my array. What if I wanted my employee to have maybe work days and then show this array of the different work days? But I don't want to actually change the original data or the original variable. Well, I can again make a copy and add something onto it. So let's do that. I'm gonna say employee extended. And again, I'm going to utilize either const or let. And just like before, I'm going to utilize the spread operator, specify that I want a direct copy of employee. And then after that, I'm going to go ahead and add my next key, which are working days. And my working days are going to be my array. Well, now when I console.log my employee extended, we're going to see an object that has name, age, shoes, profession, and working days. Again, the spread operator is strictly just creating a copy. It's not changing the original value. If oh, go ahead.
Why did you declare working days as a string versus in creating the object initially, it's more of a variable?
Yeah, that's a great question. So to Brandon's question, he's saying, why is it that when I create my object, am I utilizing this key of working days and I'm specifying it as a string rather than doing it up here where I'm not putting it as a string to specify the property? Well, this is syntactical sugar. You could either do it with quotation marks or without quotation marks. There is no preference to it. I could take them off and it would still work perfectly fine.
Okay.
The main reason why I utilize quotation marks is because in Python, that's enforced where keys have to be in quotations, and I just keep it consistency as much as possible. Does that answer?
Okay. Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Any other questions regarding the spread operators for objects or arrays?
Is that just a common practice where you tend to just, if there's a way to make things universal between languages, you just do? Or is it just whatever's preference to you and then you change it to whatever language you need it to be?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when it comes to that, as far as preferences go, Adam, you could correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure in JavaScript, the preference is that you do not put it in quotation marks. What I rely on when it comes to cleaning up my code between Python and JavaScript is my extension here for Prettier for JS. It makes sure that if I have something that's not, industry standard, it cleans it up and puts it in the correct format. That way my code looks nice and pretty. It has the spaces wherever there is spaces that there need to be. I preferably don't like leaving this many spaces between everything. And that's the reason why I have that Prettier extension. For me personally, I utilize those quotation marks because I know since I'm bouncing back and forth between the languages, the last thing I want is to have that in the back of my mind. Although it may sound like a really small thing, it can get in the way and cause a lot of unexpected errors.
Yeah,
Answer your question?
totally. Because we're teaching and switching back and forth, it's a little different. But when you're doing work professionally, you would follow the conventions of the language. And like you said, Francisco, the convention for JavaScript is not to use the double quotes because you don't need them. But since Francisco and I hop back and forth a lot, we keep the double quotes. I would encourage you all to just follow the language convention until you find it a problem or a pain point. And even better, like Francisco was saying, install the VS Code extension prettier. There's one called Pep8 or Black for Python as well. And then every time you save the file, it'll do all this work for you.
All right, Daniel?
Yeah, so what happens if you have like multiple employees? So like let's say if I was an employee, would you just make an entirely new object saying let employee 2 equal name, or would you actually add my name to the key name?
That's a great question. And so employee name, would I add your name? No, I would just make an entire new object. So objects are going to remain the same, kind of like you see here in the Poke API, right? So the object has this key of abilities. It has a key of base experience, cries, and all this other stuff. But if I were to just take a look at all of the available Pokemon, right? Let's say I do something like, I don't know, let's say I grab the first 10 here. All right, so this is the first 10 Pokemon that it has available. And it gives me a pretty good way to work through pages, et cetera, et cetera. But the point here is, notice how I have all 10 Pokemon here, and they're all following the same exact object. They all have the key of name and the key of URL. The only thing that changes between these objects are its contents. Does that answer your question, Daniel?
Yeah, so it would basically have it kind of nested inside the employees, right?
Right, so employees would then turn into an array, just like results is an array, and it would be an array of objects.
Thank you, that makes sense.
Of course. Brandon?
So based on my understanding, the spread operator is one of the functions is to make a copy of an array or object. My question is, why would you not just, instead of using the spread operator, set like your new variable or array to equal, like let's say you had employee 2, why don't you just set employee 2 to equal employee 1 if you want to copy? Does it have to do with like shallow copying and deep copying? Because I'm kind of confused on those topics.
Yeah, that's a great question, Brandon. And let's go ahead and take some time to go into that a little bit more. Before I demonstrate that question, let me go ahead and address Chris's because this one might take a minute. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, basically not exactly the same question, but okay, yeah. So the spread operator copies only objects in arrays or just the objects? Like, what is it only for?
It creates a copy of both objects and arrays.
Okay, and it labels out each line, I'm assuming, right? That's
It
what it.
would.
Okay. Is this more simpler than doing like a for loop or something to print out each whatever line, or is this like a more advanced thing to do, or this is like the basic? Like, I'm trying to.
Got it. Yeah, so this is definitely something that's in the intermediate portion of JavaScript and not the introductory portion. So this
Okay.
is definitely like a level up from the introduction.
Got you. Yeah, it is. I'd never. Okay, cool. Are we gonna have practice with this spread operator like today for assignments or?
The capability will be there, but the assignments will not enforce it.
Okay.
All right. So let's go and address the question about deep and shallow copying. Now, this portion is not in our curriculum, I'm pretty sure. So let's go ahead and talk about it a little bit. What's the easiest way I could do this? Let's see. Let me grab this array up here or this demo of an array.
With this example, could you add like another employee to just like be able to add another employee and do this test at the same time kind of thing? Or is that too much?
Another employee.
Are you saying like spread an employee into a new object and then add in like extra key value pairs?
Yes, basically. Just to see how it works, kinda.
Yeah, we'll do that real quick. Let's take a look at what we have here, right? So we're gonna start with just our employee. And oh, I see a question from Erica. Go ahead.
I can wait until after the explanation.
Okay, great. So we can see an employee here. And let me go ahead and run this example. So I see employee works well, and it's there, right? Well, now let's make an employee 2. And this employee 2 is going to be equal to employee, right? Well, now I want employee 2 to have a new key, and I'm gonna actually bring this in. I'm gonna name this new key working days, and I'm gonna make that equal to my array. And then I'm gonna go ahead and console.log employee 2. All right, so we should see 2 separate objects here. So here's my first console.log. That's just referencing employee. And here's my second console.log of employee 2. Well, now let's take a look at what happens if I change this console.log back to employee. All right. Now, when I run this, I still get 2 objects that don't look the same. Right? I added a key to employee 2, but it's still mutated employee 1. So what exactly is happening here? Let's take a look. So what we did was we created a variable named employee. This variable is linked to this array.
Is that called a reference?
Yep. So this says our reference, right? And it's linked to this array. Well, when I move on and I make employee 2, and I made it equal to employee, well, that attempts to link to employee. But as we know, employee is just an empty variable. It doesn't actually, like the employee needs to have an actual value inside of it. So even though employee 2 is a separate name for a variable, it's still mutating the original data. Right? They're linked to one another. So now let's change the way we're emphasizing employee 2. Instead, what I'm going to do for employee 2 is I'm going to utilize the spread operator to then grab employee. Well, now when I run this, we can see that the original value for my employee never changes. Well, that's because when I made employee 2, I didn't make a reference to the original employee. Instead, I made a copy of the original data and set it to a new variable. That's what breaks the link there. So the first one was a shallow copy, or not really a copy. We're just referencing an old data, right? And having a different way of managing it. While in our second example for employee 2, where we're utilizing this spread operator, we're actually creating a copy of the data, right? We're occupying more memory space and we're creating a new variable. Does that answer your question? I think that was Brandon Yo.
Yes.
All right, awesome. And I think after that, Erica, you had a question as well?
Yes, if you're combining 2 objects and you have overlapping keys, I assume one of them is going to override the other one. Is there a way to like decide which one?
That's a great question. So when it comes to that specific scenario, there is going to be a lot of ifs that we run into. I'm not sure if I could demonstrate that pretty quick, but let me try. All right, so we have our employee here. Let's say I want my employee to have a new profession. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and say, hey, I want you to have a new profession here, and this profession should be running. I'm going to go ahead and console.log employee 2. Well, when I run this information, we can see that the spread operator worked just fine. I created a copy, but when it gets to profession, rather than having eating like I did in the original structure, it now has running. So this is as simple as saying, if I want the profession to change, then I should include it when I establish the variable. If I don't want the profession to change, then I shouldn't include it. Or I could handle this as separate behavior in an if and else conditional statement down below for 86. So maybe if I can do something, I'm gonna create a copy here, and maybe I can say if employee 2 dot age is greater than, I don't know, when do kids start running? I'm assuming like 3. Nope, because my kid runs and she's 2, so let's do that. Then I could do employee 2 dot profession is equal to running. All right, so I could execute it this way as well, and it would still come up with the same answer. Does that answer your question, Erica? All right, I see the nods. Fantastic.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Arjun.
So how would you destructure an array of objects?
How would I destructure an array of objects? Ooh, that's a good one. Well, I would destructure it in the parental way, and then after that, I would have probably like a scope mechanism. So let's go ahead and build an array of objects. Why not? Let's see, let's do staff is equal to, and let's just do Adam, Francisco. Who else is in the staff? Nick, Raphael, Benjamin, and finally Zainab. So
Beautiful names.
thank you. So finally, I'll just go ahead and say I'm gonna build a function. Let's say let staff objects be equal to an empty array here, and I can say for let member of staff. Then I can just say, all right, I apologize, everyone. Staff objects dot push. I'm just gonna say name, or yeah, let's do first name. And let's do first name be member. Then all the other things will remain the same for now. If I had actual data or like a CSV file, this would probably look a little bit different, but I'm just doing this for demonstrational purposes. Description, and I'm just gonna put awesome. All right, so now let's console.log my staff objects. So there you go. I have staff objects. I have an array of a couple of objects here, right? So that's what my staff objects will end up looking like. Well, now if I wanted to destructure that, it actually gets a little bit complicated. And this is what I mean by that. So one, the parental data type here, or the one that I can apply to, is going to be my array. So I could destructure my array doing so like this. Let's say, let's see, Adam, Francisco, maybe I don't need Nick, Raphael, Benjamin, but I do want Zainab, so let's bring back Zainab. Oh. And let's say I put this over to staff objects. All right. Well, now let's go ahead and console.log Adam. And there you go. I have Adam. Right now I've done a little bit of destructuring to grab the parental element, or to grab from the very top layer. All right, destructured the array. Well, now from destructuring the array, I can destructure each individual object. So maybe I want the age pertaining to Adam. So I could say const age and description for Adam. Oh, and that's wrong. Let me fix that real quick. Well, now if I console.log age, and let's actually grab first name as well, since that's the only one that's actually different. Let's console.log first name. Well, now we'll see Adam's name. But here is the problem, right? I also have a considerable amount of other objects that I've destructured that I can grab this information from. But if I try to do the same thing from Francisco, you can see that I'm going to be running into some issues, right? I could try to utilize let, and maybe that will let me have a different option there, but it doesn't, right? I still continue running into the same issue. So I would have to figure out a way to scope this. And what I mean by that is I can iterate through the array, which is the parental structure. And actually, let me bring all that code back so that people still have it accessible to them. I can iterate through the array, which is the parental structure, and I can say for let staff in staff objects. Oh, and that's not in, that should be of. And then what I can do is I can grab each one. Well, now I can say let first name, age, and description of staff. And I can console.log the first name without having an issue. And it would then iterate through each member of the staff and do object destructuring for each one of them. All right. That was a little bit of a demonstration rabbit hole, but did that answer your question there, Rajan?
Yes, yes, thank you.
Of course. Go ahead, Raven.
For when you destructure from staff to staff objects, is it usually not case sensitive? So you're calling out Adam lowercase a and then F lowercase f and then Zainab lowercase z. Is it able to just find it even though it's not uppercase?
Got it. So what you're talking about is this destructuring here, and I should clarify that. So when you're destructuring an object, these variables that you're establishing have to match the actual keys. They have to be exactly the same. I can't just make up something and expect it to guess which one of those attributes it's supposed to grab. But when I'm destructuring an array, it's as simple as just establishing variables. I can name them whatever I want. I can say A, F, and Z, and it would still work the same. I don't have a console.log. There you go. And it would still work the same, right? When it comes to arrays, you're establishing variables and it matches by the index location. When it comes to objects, you have to make sure that the keys and the variables are exactly the same. Does that answer your question, Raven?
Yes, thank you.
Of course. Go ahead, Daniel.
So even though we're just printing out the key value of first name, we still have to list all the keys, like first name, age, description. Like we can't just delete description and age.
Yes, you can. You could definitely get rid of those. And because it is an object, it will grab description itself. I think so. Why did that throw an error? Let's take a look here.
You didn't put description. Yeah.
There you go. There you go. When it
Thank you.
comes to objects, you can grab them directly. All right, everyone. So now that we've talked about the spread operator, let's talk about the mapping function. And actually, I apologize. Before we even start talking about the mapping function, what we should talk about is arrow functions. So I'm going to go ahead and comment all of this here. Make sure everything is clear in my terminal. You guys are going to get a lot of commented code. All right. And let's take a look at our add_to function down here. So this add_to function has been established and it works great. But this is no longer the JavaScript convention for writing functions. Right? It's now considered kind of old. So instead, the convention that you should be practicing is going to be arrow functions, where you establish const followed by the name of the function. You make that equal to parentheses, which are supposed to be your parameters, and then your arrow function, which works almost exactly the same. All I need to do is let result be equal to num plus 2 and return result. Now, when it comes to efficiency and how they work, under the hood, I'm pretty sure this second portion is supposed to be more efficient, and that's the reason why it's become the new practice. Please do not ask me how it's more efficient, because that's definitely something above my level at this point. This is definitely the new convention, and we ask everybody to write your functions this way. Again, it starts with const, the name of the function. You utilize the equal sign. Then everything falls normal. Parentheses to represent the parameters that your function is going to be taken in. And then finally, your arrow function, which has the body within it. Does anyone have any questions regarding arrow functions?
If I remember correctly, regular functions have the this keyword, but arrow functions do not. There's a lot of other like differences like that that are pretty minor, but it's usually a bad practice to use the this keyword for functions. And that's why I think it's going to be more modern.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. Murad?
And then just to clarify, you do want us to use arrow functions for all of our assignments?
Oh, you're gonna have to give me a second, Brandon. Murad, how
Sorry.
to
Yeah, I like the same question. Shall I always, whatever assignment or in general life, I mean, when we start working, shall I always write any function like in this form, in the form of arrow function?
Yes.
So we would forget the old way or the old-fashioned one, right?
Correct. You're gonna be
Okay.
utilizing arrow function and moving on.
All the
And
time, arrow function.
yes, that should be like
Okay.
your default go-to.
Okay, thank you, Francis.
Of course, Daniel?
And then calling the function is just as normal. You just do you just call it as like result equals add to, and then console.log result. So it's still the same, right?
Yes, that's exactly the same. So if I wanted to do let result be equal to add 2, and then I run it this way, that would work exactly the same. All right. Now, there is a little bit of a difference between these two. All right. In functions, I have to explicitly tell my function when to return. Well, that's not necessarily the case in arrow functions. And we're going to take a look at that utilizing the map method. So this is why it's important to learn a little bit of the arrow functions before we go into mapping. And let me grab this array here of numbers, because it's going to be the easiest one to do. Let's do let array of nums be equal to, and there we have our array of numbers. Well, this array of numbers can do things and return them as well, right? So we want to map through each one of these indexes and apply some sort of behavior to each one of them. Well, I can do this utilizing the for each loop, right? I can say for, or I can utilize for each, or I can say for let num of array of nums, and then I can do add to and pass in array of nums. All right, and maybe I want a new thing. Maybe I want let nums plus 2 be equal to an empty array. And I'm iterating through this stuff so that I can go ahead. Oh, probably not that. I want nums. So then I can do num plus 2 dot push. And I can pass that information to build this num plus 2. All right, well, let's console.log num plus 2 now. So we can see that it worked. It was able to go through the array and add to each one of them. But this was quite a bit of coding, right? I had to make the function. I had to make the function. I had to establish an entirely new array manually, and then make the for loop manually and tell it, hey, this is how I want you to treat the result of this, which seems like a lot of syntax that's not necessary. Now, what do I mean by that? Why is the syntax not necessary? Well, let's try to make this a little bit simpler here. Oh, hello. What is that? All right. So rather than trying to make num plus 2 an empty array, what if I try to make let nums plus 2 the return value of a specific function? Well, again, I'm going to go through my array of nums. Just like before, I wanted to iterate through the entire array of numbers. Well, how do I iterate through them? All I need to do is say, I want to map. And maybe I could, before we go into establishing this, I can demonstrate it so that we can see how this mapping function works. I'm going to pass in a variable there. And I'm going to go ahead and console.log num. Well, when I execute this, we can see that it's just working exactly like a for loop. It's iterating through each individual index and logging that number over to my console. Go ahead, Mikhail.
Why is there a blue squiggly line every time you type nums?
Yes, this blue squiggly line is because I was making a lot of spelling errors in my code. So I have this extension that's checking my spelling, and this is just telling me that I don't know how to spell. It's coming from C-spell. Does that answer your question, Mikhail?
Yeah.
All right, I see the thumbs up. Go ahead, Murad.
So now we will not use for loop again. We are just using map every time we need to iterate, right?
So it's definitely user preference, but we do recommend that you get used to mapping.
Oh, so yeah, that would be better. Yeah, I think.
All
But
right.
I mean, if I use map every time I need for loop, that's okay. That's fine, right? It will give me the same result
Yes, that's okay.
every time.
Yes, you should be able to apply it to every scenario.
Because I was asking before, one of my friends, he's a programmer, he's a professional programmer. So when I asked him about some problems should be solved with the for loop, he said, we don't use for loop. We just use mapping.
There you go. All right.
Okay. So that's, yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Here's a little bit of nuance, Morad. So for most problems, you can solve it using map. However, for some problems, it's actually more efficient to use a for loop, but those are a little bit more rare. And for 99% of your problems, you're going to want to use map. Does that answer your question better?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Connor.
All right. So there we have our mapping function. I'm able to iterate and grab each individual thing. And before I built this entire function named app2 that would conduct some type of behavior over and over again. Well, what if instead of writing app2, I do it within the body, right? I do console.log plus 2, right? Well, now when I run it, it works perfectly fine. It's able to grab 2 and 10 and so on. But what is array of map actually doing here? Well, let's try it out. I'm going to go ahead and console.log just my array of nums here, utilizing the mapping function. And I want to see what kind of statement I get at the end of that. Well, that's weird. It looks like I get an entire array of undefined. So that's really cool. This is letting me know that this is also creating a copy, right? Or it's creating an entirely new array, and it's expecting a return value. So if I were to iterate through this a little bit more, I could probably open this back up, and instead of, or I could keep it closed, I could have a return statement where I'm saying return num plus 2. And then I run through it, and we can see that it's actually returning an entirely new array of num plus 2. That's great. Now I wrote this return statement, but is it necessary? Right? If the point of this is to save me syntax, I would assume that there's got to be a better way to make this return something by default. Well, there is. Instead of utilizing a curly bracket, I could utilize a parentheses to close my mapping function, and that will automatically return without the need for the return keyword.
And this is called an implicit return, right?
Yes, that's correct. All right. So now I have my return statement. I was able to make a new array, right? So the mapping function is returning a new array that I can store inside of another variable. So just like before, what if I want to do array plus 2 is equal to array nums dot map, and I then console.log nums plus 2. But when I execute this, I get the same exact answer that I did when I wrote this entire chunk of code, all compressed into one single line of code in line 146. All right, I see a question from Chris.
Yes. Do y'all have a vocabulary sheet for different code, like how he was saying, is this an implicit whatever equation or a result, like in references and stuff? Do you have a vocabulary sheet for us to like look at to learn the different wording of, especially like for interviews and things of that nature?
Yeah, you know, that's actually a really good question. Unfortunately, we don't, but that's something that we should have. So we'll go ahead and make an effort to try to make that happen. Also to create a cheat sheet for this type of information. Thank you for bringing that up, Chris.
Anytime.
Mikhail?
In line 146, since it's so small, I don't even think you need the parentheses around the num plus 2 or the num. It works just the same.
Ah, got it. So you're saying that I don't need this
Or that.
this.
Yeah, it's gonna work just the same.
Yep, that is correct. The reason why I did not cover that is because I don't want to open the door for confusion. Please try to put all of your bodies and different variables inside of their own isolated block. Because as your functions grow and they require more complexity, you'll need this little brackets to isolate everything. So just out of common practice, try to enforce it. As you become more comfortable with JavaScript and your coding overall, you can then start messing around with, oh, I don't need this, I could remove it, or I do need it, I'll have it in there this time. But thank you so much for pointing that out, Mick. Daniel?
Yeah, my question is, so just making sure I'm correct. So mapping will iterate through the elements, correct?
Yes.
And how do we iterate through? Can we use mapping to get the index?
That's a great question. So first of all, mapping will iterate through the elements, yes, but it also returns an entirely new array, right? Now, as far as index goes, you can do something like IDX. And rather than doing this, I'm going to go ahead and, am I spelling that right? Yes, I am.
So basically, this is just shorthand for looping, right? That's what it looks like to me.
Essentially, yes. Right, so I could still grab the index itself. If I just put IDX on the right-hand side, IDX will be representing the index. And this IDX is just a variable. I can name it whatever I want. I could utilize I could utilize K. It's just a variable. It knows that the second element or the second argument is going to represent the index. Does that answer your question, Daniel?
Yes, thank you.
Of course. Murad?
Okay, can we use the same feature in Python, the mapping, or just in JavaScript?
There is a mapping method for Python, and we're going to be covering that tomorrow, but it is it's going to require you to be pretty proficient with Lambda functions, which we'll also cover tomorrow.
Okay, thank you.
Of course. Cody?
Yeah, two things. One, how did you highlight and then put parentheses on both sides at the same time?
Highlight and put parentheses. You mean like this?
Yeah.
Yeah. If you just highlight the text and then add parentheses in there, like the opening bracket, it's gonna automatically place it on both sides.
Okay.
Yeah, just try it. It's automatic.
All right.
Okay. Yeah. As soon as I thought that erased it. Nope. Yeah, that works. Nice. Thanks. And then lifesaver there. But and then the second question. So you said it, but it just confused me, and I just like a quick reiteration. So you have num comma I. The I is a variable, and that which just means it's gonna be num. Like whatever num is, it's gonna be put into I.
No, I is representing the index, so it could be confusing because I have 1, 2, and 3. Let me do this.
Well,
Instead,
it would be it would be the second parameter of the map method. Right? So
So-
because the map method only accepts 2 parameters.
it accepts a total. It could accept up to 3. So let's look at this map method real quick. And here, if I hover over it, it's going to give me a little bit of an example of what's going on. All right, so it tells me, hey, map is going this. You're doing this to an array of numbers, and you're going to go ahead and utilize the map method. So it tells me a little bit about what map does. It looks like it has a callback function. We're not going to talk about that just yet. But the map method, it tells me, hey, we can take a total of 3 parameters. The first one is going to be the value that's going to represent the number. All right, again, I have an array of numbers. So this is telling me my first argument will represent the number. Right, so here's my number. Then it tells me my second argument will represent the index. All right, so here I have I, which is just, and it's telling me that the type that it's going to be is the index. And then finally it says, all right, well, what we're going to return is going to be an array of numbers, if any. So there you go. Num is a variable. Again, I could name it whatever I would like, but it's going to represent each individual element within the array. And I is, again, a variable, but it's going to represent the index at which I'm currently located within the mapping function. Does that answer your question, Cody?
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you very much.
Of course. All right, Dustin?
I'm just trying to figure out why it was, I guess, logging or printing the list of numbers in that way when you had it 0 to 8. So when it would print on the screen, it, it's listed 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then 7, 8, 9, 10. And it looks like there's a space, an extra space before 5. It just looks like when you did map, it prints it differently on the console than if you did just console log.
Are you referencing this here?
I'm referencing that, yeah, and the whole thing. Just why is it yeah, printing like that?
I'm not sure as to why it's deciding to console.log in this specific way. But I know the functionality and how it works and the way that it's working, what its results are. I'm sure there's something that you can do to change how your console behaves and the way that you want it to print it.
Okay, so I mean, okay, it just seemed like map was changing something about it to how it was showing up, but it doesn't, right? It's the same.
Right, it's the same.
Okay, thank you.
All right, Daniel?
What if you want to get just the index by itself? Do you just put like a comma in the placeholder of num?
Yeah, we could try that out. Let's see what it does. Well, if I try that out, it looks like it's already giving me an error, right? So it's not really accepting that. In order to access that second element, so this first one, it's going to be required, and I think it says it here. Let me see. Doesn't say it there, but let me try here.
Use an underscore.
Well, the underscore isn't skipping it. You're still passing in the argument. Give me a second here. Yeah, so you can't skip that first argument. Something has to represent it.
Oh,
right?
the underscore can represent it.
Say again?
Yeah, if you remove the num and put an underscore and then comment out 148, you can still get I printed out. So if you delete
Yes.
that, put an underscore there.
Yes, I understand that. So if I change this to for an underscore, we still get the same behavior. What I'm trying to get to here is that you need something in this first parameter. You can't just leave it blank. You can leave the second parameter blank and it will work just fine. But the first one needs to have something passed. A usual convention is to utilize an underscore to symbolize, hey, this isn't important. I don't need it. I'm not going to reference it. All right. So that's where this comes from. But it's still holding the value and it's still representing the correct value. As you can see, I'm still printing out my array and it's still being it's still making a new copy of the array with that return statement. All it's doing is essentially putting something that doesn't describe the content. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, so is there a way we could just print out the index, I guess? Is it just console log.i? That's it.
If you just wanted the index, you could just comment the second part. There you go.
Oh, thank you.
Of course. Murad?
Okay, I didn't get the third parameter. You said the third parameter we can be array. I didn't get it. What? Can you give me example, please?
Yeah, we're going to be covering map later on a little bit more in depth once we get into not into JavaScript, into React. This is the part where we're going to stop for now, just to make sure that everybody gets some iterations and practicing with mapping functions.
Okay, thank you.
Of course.
Okay, thank you.
All right, everyone. We just went through the mapping function. Let's see, is filter in here? It looks like filtering isn't in here, but it is important to cover. And actually, we've been going for a pretty long time. Let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break. Let's come back at 2:55 and continue on with our lecture. Thank you so much, everyone. And recording. We currently finish with understanding how this mapping function works. And it doesn't seem like we're going to be covering filter today. So we'll likely cover filter once we get to our React portion. The next portion of today, I definitely recommend looking into that built-in method though, a filter. Leave that for you all to explore. The next thing we're going to go ahead and talk about is going to be our export and import statements within JavaScript. All right. So export and import statements within JavaScript. I'm going to go ahead and comment all of this code here so that I don't have anything to run there anymore. And let's go ahead and make another file here named runner.js. So now I have runner and I have example here. I'm going to go ahead and write this factorial function. You can grab this straight from our curriculum. It's right at the bottom of lesson 2. So let's go ahead and make this factorial function. I'm going to say const. Oh, hello. Factorial is equal to, it's supposed to take in a number. And now I'm going to say let product be equal to 1. Oh, hello. New keyboard. I apologize getting everything used to where it's supposed to be. All right. And this is utilizing a for loop, but we just learned the mapping function. So let's try to do that. And how could I do that? Actually, I stand corrected. Let's go ahead and keep our for loop. I'm going to say for let I be equal to num. While I is greater than 0, I'm going to go ahead and say I minus minus. I'm going to subtract 1 from I and work down all the way to 0. And then finally, my product is going to be equal to the product itself times I, which is going to be equal to my number. So it's just building a factorial function. All it's going to do now is it's going to return my product at the very end of that. So this should work great. And you may be wondering to yourself, well, why do I need to export or import anything? Well, as you'll learn, your files are going to get extensively long. It is not uncommon for JavaScript files to be over 100 lines of code. It is not uncommon for Python scripts to go to be over 100 lines of code. So it is very important that we keep things isolated and divided as much as possible so that if an error does arise, we can get a pretty good idea of where that error is coming from. Not only that, but it's going to help us have a much nicer experience when trying to read or evaluate code. So what I typically try to do is I try to write functions or any sort of complex code inside of a separate file. I typically name this file utilities.js or py, and then I have a runner or somewhere where I'm actually executing these tools. But the question is, how do I get this factorial to exist inside a runner? Right? It's not something that's necessarily as simple as saying, I'm sure we've all seen this in Python where I just say from example.js, I want to import factorial. Well, that's not exactly how that works. And I see a question there. Go ahead, Tim. This would be a good time.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, why do you set the list that you're creating from that for loop to 1 instead of 0? That was my only question. Yeah, let product equal 1 instead of 0. Any particular reason or?
Yeah, so I'm not actually creating a list here. I'm trying to grab the factorial. So the purpose of the factorial problem is to figure out what each number can result when it multiplies the product. So I'm starting at 1 because 1 times itself is, going to work out for me here. I is going to represent the number. So if I were to do something as the number 3, well, 3 times 1 is going to give me 3 in the product. When I go to 2, 3 times 2 will then give me 6, and then it goes back down to 1. So 3 times 1 will then give me this number one more time.
I get it. I'm an idiot. I was just thinking that like that's where you were storing the product, basically, and not what you were multiplying by. So yeah.
Got it. All right, no problem. And you're not an idiot whatsoever. It's just code being code. Go ahead, Murad.
How it will look like if we use the map method?
Yeah, if I try to utilize the map method here, I may have to put a little bit of elbow grease to try to figure that out. I'm gonna go ahead and save that for later because we do have a considerable amount
Isn't
of...
the map method just for arrays, and because we're not dealing with an array here, we wouldn't actually use it?
Yeah, so the map method would actually just fall within arrays. You could build an array of a number and then try to iterate through it. Again, I'm gonna save this question for later, and then we can talk about it once I finish the content.
So you wouldn't use map for this, you'd actually use something called reduce, which hasn't been covered yet.
There you
It's
go.
called what?
It's called reduce.
Okay, reduce.
Yes, reduce.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so now I have my example. I have my runner. I'm gonna get factorial to exist within my runner, but how could I do that? Right? It's not as simple as it is in Python. Like I mentioned earlier, I can't just specify some sort of dot notation path to bring it in. Well, there's two ways of doing it. There's the old way, and then there's the new way whenever you have an npm module. Well, let's start where I don't have some sort of node package manager, right? How could I do that? How could I export this one function? Well, all I'm going to do is I'm going to come to the very bottom of my file, and I'm going to say, hey, I want my module to export, and I could just say factorial. So all I'm going to export is factorial. And now it's expecting somebody else to call it and be able to utilize that factorial function. So I'm going to go over to my runner, and I'm going to utilize the require keyword to bring in that function. So I'm going to say const factorial is equal to require. And this require method is then going to take in a path. Well, where is it that you want me to grab something from? I want you to grab it from example React.js. And now, if I go ahead and console.log factorial 3, and I go ahead and execute my runner, we can see that it was able to execute correctly and bring me the answer for the factorial of 3. Right, it looks much cleaner. I don't need to put my entire logic inside of this file. I could just bring it in from a separate file. So now the next question is, well, that works great for one function, but what if I had many functions? Well, let's bring back that add2 function that we created. Where did you go? Yeah, here you go. All right, so here we have this function named add2. Well, how could I pass it in? Well, module.exports is actually, it works kind of like an object. So I can also pass in factorial, and I can then pass in my add2 function. Well, what does that say here? Right, if I'm grabbing an object, well, how do I make this work correctly? Well, I can utilize destructuring again. All right, I want to destructure that object. Factorial still works. And now I can grab add2 as well. And console.log the result of add2 with 5, which should return 7. It looks like I have a bit of an issue here, which comes from a number not defined in example.js, line 139. Example.js, line 139. That's when we were talking about scope. So that makes sense. And there you go. So now we can see factorial and add2 have both been exported out of this one file. And I grab them inside of runner.js, utilizing some object destructure. Does anyone have any questions over exporting and importing without an NPM manager?
Yeah, can you tell me one more time how I know you said we put require and we will import it from the example of the .javascript, right? But you wrote something in the beginning, said another line, but I can't see it now. Or this is only what I need to do.
This is all you need to do. Yes, you're gonna go ahead and grab the individual objects that you're looking for, or the individual functions, objects, variables. You can export pretty much anything from this one file. And I'm telling it, you're going to grab this information from this file. And that's why I'm using the require keyword there. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, you said something about module, something like that.
A module?
Yeah, a module.
That's coming from example.js at the very bottom. Whenever you're exporting, you need to utilize module.exports.
Okay, thank you.
Of course, Chris.
So if we're exporting a function from another JS file, does that file needs to be near where example for runner is at in your local in your computer or in your file in your folder? Sorry.
Yeah, that's a good question. So once we have an NPM project running, then that will come into effect. But as far as in this specific context, it doesn't, right? So let's grab example.js and let's drop it on my top directory. Imports, for example, JS. I don't have any imports, so no. Okay, cool. So everything should still work. I'm going to open up a separate terminal here. And here, if I run ls, we can see example.js there. If I run node example.js, it's able to read the script properly. So I don't have to worry about it. But runner is going to have a bit of an issue now. If I run my runner, it's going to tell me, hey, this doesn't exist. You're telling me to look for runner. You're telling me to look for something called example.js within the same directory that I'm in. Well, all I need to do is fix my path here. I need to go back 2 directories. and then utilize example.js. And then it works fine because I'm telling it, I want you to go back one directory into JS intro to Py in JS PY intro. And I want you to go back a directory again, all the way back into X-ray students demos and notes. And once it goes all the way back, it's then able to find example.js, read my script, and grab my exported code. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
All right, fantastic. Any other questions?
You can also put the whole pathway to that folder too, and it'll be correct. It'll just be longer.
You could use an
Right.
absolute path, but we strongly recommend that you start learning how to use your relative paths over absolute paths. All right. Any other questions?
Yeah, Francisco, could you explain why? Because it seems like an absolute path would be more accurate with, like, if things get moved around or like, or if that, whatever, it just seems more accurate.
Definitely. Let's talk about that, right? So I'm working with a group of individuals inside of this project, and I utilize an absolute path. Well, let me go ahead and copy this absolute path here. I'm gonna copy path. I'm just gonna paste it right on there. Well, there you go. There's my entire path. It should be saved and it works properly for me, right? Everything works great. So now I share my code. And when I share my code and somebody else clones this repository, what issue are they going to be running into when they try to execute this file?
Right, that makes sense. They don't have access to users, Francisco Villa, yeah.
Yeah, this doesn't exist there, right? And they don't necessarily have to have the project living within the same exact directory that I do. So in order to avoid this and try to keep everything within scope, we utilize relative paths. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Of course. Any other questions? All right. If there aren't any other questions, it is time to go into our testing portion. So in order to go into testing, we're going to go ahead and build an NPM project. So again, NPM stands for Node Package Manager. When you build a project, just like in Git, you utilize something called NPM init. And we're going to see a couple of things populate. Now, today we're not going to go in depth into what exactly is it that happens when you run NPM init. We're not going to talk too much about every single part of the Node Package Manager or how it works. The focus of today is for us to understand how to import and export individual functions within a NPM project and how to execute the test suite. We'll learn all of the underground framework and everything that's going on within its guts later on. But again, the purpose of today is to ensure we know how to import, export, and run our test suites. So let's go ahead and get into it. So just like I previously mentioned, like in Git, when I ran Git init, I started a Git repository, right? Well, with NPM, I'm going to run my NPM init. Let's see what that does. Well, looks like I had a problem running an NPM init, or actually I don't have a problem. It looks like it's asking me a couple of questions. So I ran npm init, it's telling me, hey, this utility here is going to walk you through creating a package.json file. Well, we'll talk about package.json a little bit here shortly. We can run npm init help if I really want to, and then we can talk about installing packages. Okay, cool. So now what is the package name that you want to utilize? I'm going to go ahead and name it the same as the directory. It's already making that suggestion for me. So I can press enter. What version would I like to use? I'll keep it simple. I'm actually going to press enter for pretty much all of these here. Oh. Okay, I'm going to make this yes. All right. I'm going to clear. Well, what did all those commands just do? Well, everything that I just went through was to create this one file here, this package.json. So package.json is what's going to run your NPM project. So here we can see that it's a name here. The name is 3-JS. That means the project itself is referencing the parent directory. The version of node that it's actually executing, or the version of the node package manager that it's executing. Here we have a simple description for it. I didn't put anything, so it just defaulted to JavaScript. We have this main attribute, which we'll talk about what main is actually doing, but it's saying that our main document, the main one that it's going to run, will be example.js. We'll change that here shortly. Then we have our scripts that talk about test. Interesting. I wonder what that is. And then we have authors and licenses. Well, let's see what we can do here. All right, let's try to experiment a little bit with Node. So if I were to run npm test, I get a pretty simple command here. What made me want to utilize npm test? Well, when you run npm test, it's actually just looking at my scripts here. These are all arguments, and then it's executing whatever's to the right of it. So in this case, what it's doing is it's telling me, hey, there is an error here, and you haven't specified a test suite that we can use. Okay, great. We've made a pretty considerable amount of progress. At this point, does anyone have any questions regarding how you can start a node package manager project?
You have to be inside the folder that you're testing in order to run the npm.
Yes, you do. So if you're going to utilize any sort of npm commands, they have to be, you have to run those commands in the same location as your package.json. Does that answer your question, Mikhail? I see the nods. Awesome.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't get that. Can you repeat it again?
Yeah. So currently I'm within, if I run ls, you can see that I have package.json.
Uh-huh.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Okay, so if I run npm test, it's able to execute this command and give me the result from my scripts here, because npm is looking for a package.json to start and run any functionality that I needed to. Well, if I were outside, like in these directories where I don't have a package.json, and I run npm test, I'm going to get a bunch of errors. And all of these errors are coming from the simple fact that it doesn't know if this is an npm project. There's no package.json. It tells me, hey, I tried to look for a package.json, but I couldn't find it. This can't be an npm project. Where am I supposed to go? Right, so here we go. We see users, X-ray, 1JS intro, package.json doesn't exist. Couldn't find it. All right, so I need to cd back into 3, run npm test, where it's actually able to find the package.json and execute npm commands. Does that answer your question, Murad?
Yeah, but how did you download it, the package, the JSON?
I ran npm init.
npm?
Yes.
Yeah, just okay.
npm
inside the folder?
Yes.
Inside your project? Okay. Okay, thank you.
Of course.
And how was the package.json populated again?
Yeah, so once I ran npm init, it shows you a series of questions and tools. And actually, let's go ahead and do it one more time just so everybody can see it. All right, so I run npm init. It's going to ask me, oh, you want to start a package, you want to start a node package manager project. Let's see how we do here. It's going to ask me, hey, what's your package name? Well, I want it to be 3JS intro. All right, what version do you want to use? Version 1 will do the trick for me. Do you want a description? This will run unit test. And what do you want your entry point to be? Well, I want it to be example.js. My test command, don't have one. And my Git repository, don't have one for now. It's asking for some keywords, don't need one. Is there an author? myself, but I'm not gonna do that. Then it asks for a license. If I don't specify a license, it's just gonna default to ISC. I'm not sure what that is, so I'll have to get back to you all on that. And then it gives me an example of what my package.json is going to look like. It says, well, based on the information that you gave to these, based on the answers that you gave to these questions, this is what your package.json is going to look like. Is that okay? Then if I do yes, it then populates a package.json that looks exactly like the following example in my terminal. Does that answer your question? I believe that was Matilda. I see the yes. Go ahead, Brandon.
It like the part where it's like Git repository and it doesn't show in your package.json, can you just put that in later? Like,
yeah, anything that you decided to skip, if you want to add it later or your dependencies grow, or you want to add a couple more scripts, package.json is something that you can interact with and change in order to configure your project.
does it need to be in the same exact spot?
Be in the same exact spot. The interactions or what you're changing?
Like you see how Git repository is right after test command, like instead of putting it after test command, if you input it at the bottom after license, would that mess anything up?
It would not mess it up. Again, this is an object, and our objects allow us.
Oh, yeah.
Awesome. All right, Daniel.
So the purpose of the package.json file is to just test code. It is like, I'm not sure if I'm getting it mixed up or not.
Yeah, so when we write our JavaScript files are pretty much independent, right? They have no real connection with one another. As we continue writing them, they will continue to grow, and we can have scripts, and as you saw, we can export and import from one another, but there's nothing linking them. I'm sorry, I have the mic on, there you go. All right, but there's actually nothing linking them. Well, when you run npm init and you create a package.json, what that's going to do is it's going to make a parent. And where are my settings there? There you go. Nope. There you go. It's going to make a parent for my project, and that's what's going to tie them all together, saying, hey, all of you exist, but you all exist with the one purpose of running this project. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and then the main, where it has example.js, that's where all the functions would be, right? And that's where the package will have all the functions listed.
So main would be the first one that gets executed. So if I were to have a bunch of files, right, and they all wanted to execute one specific purpose, when I run my project or I try to execute my project, npm is not going to take a look at any of these other files. It's just going to strictly look at my main and execute main. Does that answer your question, Dan?
Yeah, and then what if you had like another JS file? How would you reassign that?
Yeah, if I wanted to reassign it, I could just simply come in here and change what the name of the file will be for main.
Okay, so you can only have one file for a main, correct? You can't have like multiple JS files.
Right. You can only have one file. This one file can reference other files and import different functions, but only one of them is actually being executed and read. All right, Chris?
Just to clarify, so the purpose of a package is to test what is it testing? Like if our JS files are not reading errors and we getting the results that we want, what is it? Yeah, what is it testing for?
Yeah, so we're going to be covering that here shortly. Once I get to the test suite, you just gotta give me a couple more seconds once I get there.
Gotcha.
All right, you ready?
Yeah, I want to ask the same question, but is this like making debug for your code after you write?
No, this doesn't have to do with debugging. This has to do with the ability of running unit tests, which we'll be covering here shortly. Mikkel?
Is the main function that exports the function, or is that the one that does the imports? What is example.js? What's
Yeah.
in that?
So example.js right now is doing all of our exports. So
Okay.
we wouldn't want example.js to be our actual main runner. So we could go over to package.json and change this to runner.js.
Okay, that's what should be there, right?
Yes, correct.
Okay.
All right. Awesome. So now that we have our package.json project running, we're good. We're not going to dive too much deeper into what's actually going on with NPM. We're going to start moving into getting our dependency. And this is going to be the first time we install something. Well, technically not the first time since we just did install fest, but this is the first time that we're going to install something specific to Node. And what we're going to be installing here is going to be a test suite named Jest. Again, Jest is used in the industry as the industry standard for unit test. Some people also use it for mocking some API calls, and these are called oh man. There's end-to-end, there's unit, and there's one in the middle. I apologize for not knowing the name off the top of my head. But Jest can be utilized for both API call to mock API calls and to actually just test your one individual functions. So
unit integration and end-to-end.
there you go, integration. Thank you so much. So our integration test can also be tested through Jest. All right. So let's get this installed. I ran npm in it already, and I have my node package. Well, the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to install Jest. So I'm going to say npm install -- save. So I'm telling Jest, hey, I don't just want you to install it. I want you to make sure that this gets saved for Jest. All right, and it looks in the internet, finds Jest, everything that pertains to it, and downloads it and places it within my project. So now you'll see a couple of things were created. When I installed Jest, a new addition to my object came in. I now have dependencies. And for my dependencies, I have Jest, and it tells me the version of Jest that I'm currently executing. Okay, great. But just like I said, it went into the internet and basically grabbed everything that I need in order to execute this program or this file. Well, where does all that code go? That goes in your package lock.json. Your package lock.json essentially keeps track of all the versions that are currently being managed, where they live, and what you need in order to effectively execute an installed extension or package. All right, we're never going to interact with package lock.json. We will only interact, we will not interact with package lock, but we will interact with package.json. All right. Does anyone have any questions regarding the installment of Jest?
What was the command you ran again?
Yeah, the command I ran was npm install -- save Jest, and I'm gonna pass it here on the Zoom chat. Mikhail?
So if you have multiple folders, would you have to run the npm install Jest on each specific folder if you want to do test cases on the files inside that folder?
No, because where package.json is located, that's going to be the parent, right? So if I have files here, I can also have parent folders that hold files and so on. But wherever I'm executing this, it's going to analyze that as the entire project. Does that answer your question, Mikhail?
Okay, so you said I have to do the npm init in the specific folder for the specific test, but the package.json is like, is that going to be inside the same folder or a parent folder?
Yeah, so let's try to make a mimic here. So I'm going to go ahead and make a directory of, I don't know, I'm just going to put contents for lack of better naming conventions. And then I'm going to make test, all right? Well, I could put all of my content, which is going to be runner.j, oh, not runner, which is going to be example.js. Yes. And I don't have a test file yet. So that would be pretty much it, right? So the only thing that has to stay at the same level as the package.json will be the runner. Everything else can live inside of separate directories and be referenced to, still utilize the same tools as Jest or as our package.json because it will all be executed through the runner. Does that answer your question better? All right, I see the thumbs up. Go ahead, Murad. You are muted, which is weird because you're not muted on Zoom, so you're muted in another way. All right, while that's happening, does anyone else have any other questions?
Oh, does a version of JSON matter? I noticed that it came up as version. Do we have to keep that in mind, or is that not a big deal, at least for us?
Yeah, that's a great question. So version's going to matter once we start working in our bigger projects. Depending on what it is that you're working on, you could work with an outdated project. Let's say, you get hired, you get thrown into work, and they tell you, hey, we want you to bring this one project up to
You hear
speed.
me?
Yes, could you give me a second, Murad? We want you to bring this project up to speed. And then you log on and you find out, hey, this project is like, 10 versions behind what it should be. It's gonna take me a while to do it. Well, you would change the version to the most current, and you'll realize that depending on the version, there's a lot of syntax that changes over time. So you'll just have to change a lot of syntactical sugar, or maybe even a couple of little built-in functions. Does that answer your question, Tim?
Yeah, thank you.
Of course. Raven?
Quick question, since you did the dash save, if we create another JS folder for a project, we just hit npm in it, and then that should run just because we saved it already, right? Or do we have to run just again for another folder?
You would have to install Jest again for another.
Okay, thank you.
Len?
Yeah, so I want to make sure that I understand this. So npm is to Node, like pip is to Python. It's just your package manager, right? So other people write code out there. In this case, some other person wrote Jest for testing, and we're just acquiring that code into our project. And the JSON is talking about the dependency, saying this is going to be dependent on Jest.
Yeah, so it's working in that same relationship. The only difference is that the Node package manager also starts our project and keeps everything within the project. In Python, running pip install something or anything like that doesn't start my project or the existence of it. In Python, what does that is the __ init __ .py.
Yeah, okay.
That's what starts the project and building together as a module. Does that make sense, Len?
Yeah. Just want to make sure npm is it's similar. It's not nothing's exactly the same in any language.
Exactly.
But
yeah, it's similar and its purposes are along the line of one another as pip, but it just does a little bit more than what pip does.
all right, thank you.
Of course. Murad?
Yeah, I just lost the connection like for a minute when you were showing what Just do, when you explained Just. So if you can tell me again what Just do.
I haven't gone over Jest just yet.
You saying we install it, that's it.
Yes, we just installed it and that's it.
Okay, but is okay, you didn't say anything about it, like a test or?
No, we haven't gone into it yet.
Okay, thank you.
Of course. All right. So now that we have our package, everything's going well. I installed Jest, but currently when I test, it still says that I'm not actually executing Jest, right? Well, I need to tell my project here that in order to run my test suite, I want you to execute Jest. All right. So now I have Jest installed. Everything's within my package.json. Well, earlier when I ran npm test, I got this echo command, right? Or this echo, oh, it's no longer there. this echo message saying, hey, you don't have a test suite just yet. Well, when I run npm test now, I'm getting a different behavior, right? When I run npm test now, I'm saying, hey, I want you to run npm test. It says, well, you want to utilize Jest. Let's use Jest. And then Jest goes through my files and says, well, I understand you want to use Jest, but you aren't actually showing me any test. So since there are no tests existing, I'm going to exit and let you know that you don't have any test. And then it tells me, all right, well, I checked 4 files. I don't see any __ test. And I definitely do not see anything that ends with JTS to let me know that this is supposed to be a test file. All right, so just from this one message, I could already tell I have a problem here. So I'm going to go ahead and rename that directory to __ tests. All right, so now I have my directory. I'm going to run it one more time, see what it tells me. All right. Good, I was able to find it. It says, I followed a specific pattern, but you don't have any test files just yet. All right, I see Mikkel, go ahead.
Oh, what directory did you just rename?
I named a directory tests, and I renamed it to __ tests. __.
Oh, I was following along with you, but I don't know what directory I'm supposed to rename. I'm in the directory for the that factorial.
Okay, yeah, if you run ls here, you should have the following. You should have a package.json, a package.json, a runner.js,
Okay.
a directory named content, test, and then a directory for node modules. Go ahead, Erjan.
So anytime you try to use the test, you would have to create a directory for the test itself.
Every time you use the test, you would have to create a directory for the test itself.
But
No, you do not have to always create a separate directory. We'll go into that here shortly. Just haven't gotten to the part where I'm creating a test file just yet.
okay.
All right. So we're all pretty antsy about seeing this test file. Let's go ahead and create our first test file and see what it does. So I'm going to make a test here. I'm going to say touch factorial dot spec dot JS. All right. And you're going to see a pretty clear difference here. Well, it says this says spec.js, and we can see that it's red. So it knows that it's supposed to be a test suite or in reference to a test suite. And we can see it here in the naming conventions as well, right? It says, well, we try to match something. I looked for a directory named __ test. I couldn't find anything. And I also looked for files that ended with the following extension: spec or test, and then J or TS. Right, well, now we have a spec.js. Again, that spec.js could be renamed to be test.js, but for now, we're going to keep it at spec. All right, there is no preference between spec or test. It just kind of depends on whoever you work for, what they utilize as their naming convention. The behavior is going to be the same. They're still going to create test files. All right, so now I've created my test file, but it's empty. Let me run this npm test now and see what it gives me. Whoa, all right, I got a different message. So now it says I'm actually able to find a file. I ran Jest. I found a file that matches the naming conventions that I want. Its name is factorial.spec.js, but it tells me that the test suite failed to run. Well, why did that happen? Well, your test suite must contain at least one test. All right, that's fair. So how do I write an actual test here? Well, let's go into writing our test. Len, do you have your hand up from prior, or is your...
Yep. Put it down.
All right, thank you. So let's go ahead and write this. This starts with the test convention. And now this is a... Oh man, this one just has test. All right, we're gonna actually cover this from the very top. We're gonna start every test with a describe block. And a describe block doesn't actually describe what you're testing. A describe block should point towards the file that's being tested or the point of origin that you're going to test. Right? So in this case, what I want to test is I want to test my example.js. From there, I'm going to write a callback function, and please know that this is all syntactical sugar. You do not need a describe block. You only need a test block. Describe blocks are good for grouping test. As your modules grow, you'll see that you'll have many files, many directories. It helps to isolate test through describe blocks so that people can see, oh, in example.js, this is what you tested. So now I'm going to actually write a test. And within this test block, that's where I'm going to describe what I'm testing. So and in this describe block, I'm actually going to change it to factorial.spec.js. I want to ensure Jest is working properly. All right. So there you go. Now I have my test block. But how does the test block work? Well, again, I'm going to write another callback function, and I'm kind of just nesting it all in between. But what actually evaluates a test to be true or false is going to be the expect. Oh, hello. And the to-be function. Right, there's a couple of different assertions that you can run, but the one that I'm going to run is to-be, which is almost the equivalent as a triple equal sign. So I'm going to go ahead and put that there, make that triple equals. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to expect, and we learned about truly and falsy. So 4 should be a true, right? And that's probably wrong. Let's go ahead and do true to be true, right? Okay, so there you go. I ran a describe block. My describe block specifies the file that my test is originating from. My test block is just ensuring that Jest is working properly. That's all I'm actually testing. And I'm expecting true to be equal to true. Now, when I run npm test, we can see that npm test ran successfully. It tells me, hey, this were the tests that I ran for factorial.spec.js. My test block says I want to ensure Jest is working properly. It identified one test and one test passed, and it did it in 0.262 seconds. Well, what happens if it's false? All right. So when it's false, it gives me a pretty detailed example as to what the problem is, right? It says, hey, factorial.js has a problem in the following test. All right, and it even puts an X right up here. All right, I want to ensure Jest is working properly. All right, expected received to be expected. Object is equality. All right, well, expected was false, and it received true. So here's expected. It was expecting to be false, but it received true. All right, and then it even gives me a detail in the line as to where the error is coming from. So I want to ensure Jest is working properly, expect true to be true, comes out to be wrong. Pretty simple. I'm going to go ahead and change that back to true, and that will clean up my test suite. All right, questions? Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, so in plain terms, is the testing the code for any errors, and then if it's no errors, it's true? Or is it, yeah. Or go ahead.
The test is going to be checking for not errors within your code, because if there's errors within your code, the test suite won't even run, right? If there's errors within your code, you're just going to get an error, likely like a syntax error or something like that. What the test suite is actually testing is the proper behavior of your code. It's ensuring that you're actually doing what the code is requiring you to do, right? So for example, I have let's say I have a function, well, we'll see it right now here shortly. For example, factorial, we're going to create a test for factorial where we're going to ensure that if I pass in an argument to factorial, it returns the expected output. Does that make sense, Chris?
So how would they know? How would you know the expected output? Like if they don't know, if does this test knows the math of factorial, or how?
No, you would write it yourself.
Okay.
So tell it, hey, this is supposed to be 24. And then you would write your function to make that come back to be true.
So where do you write the correct? Where are the correct answers, or where? Yeah, where's he checking to make sure it's correct, or whatever?
You're specifying what correct is. Well, we'll go into it here shortly so that you can visualize it a little better.
Gotcha.
All right, Gary.
Yeah, so you running the test, like once you initiate the test, it's running the code itself in is that in the JSON pack? Not the JSON package, what is it called? Like what is running to actually get the test? Like is it going into that file and it's running it itself and it's like, okay, this makes sense, and then it's feeding back to you that like, hey, it passed, it didn't pass. Like, is that the NPM itself?
Yeah, so when I type in npm test, well, the first command npm says, hey, I'm going to need you to take a look at package.json. So it takes a look at package.json. The next thing it does is the next argument that I passed was test. Well, it takes a look at scripts that I dictated and telling it, hey, take a look at this stuff. It looks into scripts, and because I pass in test, it works. If I pass in something like npm run, it's going to say, whoa, wait a minute, this script doesn't exist. All right, the only script that I have is test. And you can see that's adjusting there. All right. So when I run npm test, that's what initializes Jest. So then it starts with Jest. And that essentially ties back to this dependency down here. Right? Jest starts running within my machine, and then it starts looking for tests that fit the naming convention. When it finds the naming convention for a file, it starts executing that file and evaluating whether it passes or it fails. Does that answer your question?
So right here where you have test written, like that's what it's searching for, to key in on that there's actually a test to be run.
It looks for either, let's try it out. If I run that describe block, it's going to fail, right? And it's going to say that it fails because it doesn't have a test.
Right. So you have to have the word test. Like it's like one of those inherent things, like you have to have that value in there for it to run the actual test. Okay. I got you.
Yeah, it just needs the test, doesn't need the expect or to be. But the expect and to be is where the evaluation actually happens. All right, Brandon.
This is from a little far back, but do you not have to put this factorial spec.js in the test file or the folder?
We're not there yet. I'm going into folder structure here shortly.
And second question, you're probably going to get into this, but how does this tie into runner.js, or are you going to write code to test the code in runner.js? Because it looks to me like this is just testing itself or like testing nothing.
Yes, currently it's testing nothing. I'm just ensuring that Jest is working, but we will go into that stuff of connecting the runner.
Okay, thank you.
All right, Daniel.
I'm not sure if I missed it, but is there a reason why you named factorial .spec.js? Is that because it's assigning it as a test file?
The .spec is what assigns it as a test file, so that not JS, I apologize, so that Jest can actually identify it and run a test suite on it.
Okay, and so that spec.js file is essentially the input and the output of example.js, correct?
Not yet, but it will be. Yes. All right, Eric.
So in the describe block, putting factorial spec.js as the first argument sort of implies that you may have multiple testing files. Is that accurate that you will have more than one? Or is it you're just going to have one generally for a project?
You will have more than one, especially as your projects grow. Typically each, the way that I'm gonna talk about it is gonna be in regards to components. So pretty much every page or component that you create should have some sort of end-to-end test to ensure that it works properly. And that's gonna reflect as well in your unit tests. Does that answer your question, Eric?
Yep, thanks.
Of course. Erica?
I was gonna ask exactly that and add, can you, since it runs the multiple files, can you set up what order it runs them through? Or does it run it through like by in alphabetical order?
Yeah, so it runs from top to bottom, and it either goes by alphabetical or numerical order, whichever one you wanted to start with. Does that answer your question? All right, perfect. All right, everyone, we've been going on this for quite a bit. I want to make sure that the testing portion gets solidified and that it's clear to us. So let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break or 12-minute break. It's currently 3:48. Let's come back at 4 o'clock and continue on with our lecture. Thank you so much, everyone. All right, welcome back, everyone. We just got to making our first describe block. We have a test within this describe block, and we're starting to learn a little bit about our JS functionality or NPM, right? So I have this directory named __ test. Why do I have that? Well, that's where all of my tests would get isolated. I would move my test file there. And I want to keep in mind, if I utilize ls here, I'm still at the root directory where package.json is located of my project, right? Well, if I run npm test, Jest is still able to find my test suite because it goes into __ test. That's the naming convention it expects for a directory that's holding multiple tests. And then it's able to find my file with .spec.js. So it allows it to execute my test. So now I have everything pretty isolated. All right, I have my runner, which is the only thing that should be exposed at the correct level. I apologize. We haven't really covered how to make the runner run. So let's do that real quick, just to enlighten us a little bit. We're gonna add a script here. We're gonna name this script start. And all this script is going to do is it's going to run node on runner.js. Right, that's what we expect it to do. We want the runner to be executed. So now, when I utilize npm, I can say npm start. And that will simply execute my entry point of main to ensure that everything is working properly, everything that's being required is being processed and inputted inside of my main runner. All right. Awesome. I have everything isolated, all of my contents in the correct spot, and now I'm ready to actually write a test for factorial. Well, how do I do that? Right, because my factorial spec sheet needs to know about the test. So this is going to be covering exports and imports. We already talked about this. So if I could get somebody to guide me through the process, that would be really helpful.
Don't you just need to add an import using the const factorial equals the require, and then where the folder for the factorial.js is located?
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and bring in const factorial with the require function. And this require function is going to say I want you to go back one directory, go into content, and find example.js. And there it is. We have our function now imported into our correct module. Great. I have access to factorial, and I'm ready to start writing some tests. Oh, go ahead, Chris.
The way you type kind of fast, is there a shorthand for like, I think you just put E or X and it populate example, right? Or did you type that so fast that I didn't even notice? I don't know, each letter. how did you do a shorthand, I guess, putting different words in?
Yeah, that's a great question. When it comes to typing, most of the time JavaScript will know what it is, or your VS Code will know what it is that you're trying to type. So for example, if I start typing in CON, it knows that I'm likely trying to do a console, right? Instead of finishing typing all of that, I'm just gonna press the tab key and that will auto-complete for me. All
Thank
right.
you.
Of course.
If you type log, I think in tab, it'll do the whole thing.
Does it? Nice. Even faster. Thank you. Go ahead, Brandon.
Why did you put squiggly brackets around factorial instead of just writing const factorial equals require?
All right, that's a great question. Let's go ahead and move into example.js. So in example.js inside of module.exports, what am I exporting? Am I exporting an individual function or am I exporting an object?
It's an object, so you have to deconstruct it.
Right. So I pass an object, so in order to grab it, I have to grab it through object destructure. All right.
So this is basically the require is moving the test page or whatever, the factorial page to this example page. Is that what this type, the constant on the factorial on the top means?
It's not moving the entire script. It's only moving the code pertaining to this one function.
Gotcha, thank you.
Of course. All right. So now we have this information, we have our module.exports, and we finally have access to factorial. Well, let's start writing some tests for it. So I'm going to make a new describe block because I'm no longer testing factorial.spec.js. I know it works correctly. Right? Instead, what I'm testing is example.js. All right. Oh, I messed that up. There you go. All right. In an example.js, I'm going to go ahead and test that factorial function works for 3. So that's all I'm testing here. I'm being as descriptive as possible. And I'm going to expect that factorial 3 will return 6, not 56. All right. Well, now let's run this. I'm going to run npm test. We're going to see that it was able to find 2 tests. So I found one test suite. This one test suite had 2 tests inside of it. The first one was me ensuring that Jest was working. All right, so Jest was working. It worked perfectly fine. And the second test had to do with factorial working for the number 3. All right. Does anyone have... Oh, go ahead, Urjan.
I don't know if you covered this earlier or somebody asked this, but what does the describe actually do?
Yeah, so the describe block is built so that we can nest our test together, right? And our describe block should usually point towards the file that it is that you're testing. In this case, the file that I'm testing is example.js. I am testing its contents. So I named it example.js so that any test that have to do within this file can exist inside of this describe block. I'm just isolating behavior so that I can easily identify where this error is coming from. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Of course. I think it's Daniel. Go ahead.
Yeah, so going back to that factorial, can you only export object?
So going back to factorial and the way it's being exported, I could export just the function itself if I wanted to, and that would work just fine. I would just not utilize the object destructure here. This would still work. But if I'm passing in multiple things, they have to be within an object structure, which is the reason why we have to destructure on the other side. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so you recommend just every time we export like a function, you want us to like convert to an object, right? Or you would prefer.
I would suggest always putting it in an object just for simplicity's sake and for consistency. The more you can build consistency, the better. It may not be necessary, which is fine. If somebody tells me, hey, you know, that's not necessary, right? I'll just be like, oh, yeah, I know that. I just do it out of consistency. And, you know, at that point, if that individual really wants to be an individual about it, then so be it. Kyle?
Yeah, is there a way to import just an entire file? Like, so if I just have a file, a JS file with just functions that I might use a lot of, I can just shorthand something to just the whole import all of those functions?
So there is a way to do that, and we're going to be covering that once we talk about the JS 6 conventions for export and importing. That will be covered more in React.
All right.
All right. So now that we have this information here, I have my factorial function. It's running properly, and that's great. But we haven't really practiced some test-driven development. And test-driven development is becoming very popular in the industry. You know, it helps everybody assure that things aren't breaking when we're developing a new feature. So let's go ahead and get our own practice in some test-driven development. So currently I have this test and this describe block. Well, what if I wanted to write a test for a function? Let's say that the function name is going to be, I don't know, create full name accepts 2 arguments and returns a concatenate. I'm just gonna play full name. All right. So there we go. I have my information. That's gonna be my test. And what I expect this to do is I expect my create full name function to be able to accept 2 strings. So Francisco, and then my second one being Avila. And I expect it to be able to return a string of Francisco Avila. All right, and I believe, oh, that ain't it. Is it Command Shift D? Nope, that's not it either. I have to remember how it is that we do text wrap. I apologize, I'm a little rusty here. All right, so there we go. We have our test. I have a function that doesn't exist yet, and I expect it to work correctly. All right, I expect it to be able to bring in Francisco Avila. Okay, great. Well, when I run this test suite, I should expect to see a fail. Good. I'm doing test-driven development correctly. The first portion of test-driven development is red, right? So we see red, and then we want to work to turning that red into green. All right, so I specified what passing looks like. But now I have to make sure that this test passes. So first, I want to try to import a create full name function. I know create full name doesn't exist yet. So let's go and create it. So create full name. Again, doesn't exist. Let's do it. Create full name. I'm just going to make an empty function here. That's all it does. I have an empty function named create full name. It's being exported, and I'm importing it within my test file. Well, let me run my test now and see what issue I have. All right. So now we're making progress here. It says, well, create full name exists. That's great. And it accepts 2 arguments, supposed to return a name. Here's what it received. It received Francisco Avila, but it didn't return anything, right? It returned undefined. My function is not returning anything when being called or when being passed parameters. Good. So how do I get this function to pass? Somebody walk me through this process.
you have to create a parameter for first and the last name, and then return them.
All right, so there we have F name, we have last name. And you said just return them?
Return them with a space in between.
Okay. Like this?
Plus you can just do a string interpolation. So do the, yep, and then the $sign in between.
Okay. Now what?
Yeah, the $sign, and then for the same with the last name as well.
All right, let's go ahead and do that real quick. All right, so now we have my function. It's actually returning something. We made it a pretty long process here, or we made it through this pretty well. All right, I'm returning my function. All right. Now let's run this edge case. Great. It works and it's able to pass. But is this all I have to consider when I make a function? Right? What happens if I run in with, hey, what if I want to test that create full name doesn't accept parameters that are not string. Right, so let's go ahead and do that here. And let's expect create full name to take in maybe 2 and 3. And dot to be these arguments are not string. Well, how could I make this test pass now? Because if I run this test here, we're gonna get false, right?
Where does the to be come from, by the way? I've never seen that command before. I was just curious.
Yeah, dot to be just has to do with Jest. It's just its own syntax. It's a little bit different. All it's doing is running test, expect, and then to be is the equivalent of like a triple equal sign. Does that answer your question, Tim?
Yep, thank you.
We would need to raise an exception.
All right, so what does that look like? I go over to example.js. How do I treat this?
We could do a try block.
All right, so let's do a try block. All right, my try and catch. So now what?
We want to set we want to check the type of for F name and L name to make sure that they are type of string. So if type of F name, L name is not equal to string, then we want to raise the exception.
Could you do the same for F name, L name, same line?
Likely there's a shorter syntactical way that I could write this. But for clarity of what we're trying to write here, I'm gonna write it in this fashion. All right, so there you go. So now I have if the type of L name or if first name is not equal to string, what is it that we want to do now?
Return false or what?
Return that string you put inside the test.
All right, so I come over to my test, I could grab this, and if we're doing it this way, then there's not really a need for a try and catch block, right? I can return. This will kill my function. So I can now remove this information here. Oh, hello, that's not what I wanted to do. All right, so there's my function. So now the first thing it does is if it checks if they are not string types. If they aren't string types, it will return these arguments are not string. Otherwise, it will continue working its functionality. Let's see what it does now. Well, it seems to fail. And now it's failing when I'm passing in the correct arguments. All right, where do we think that error is coming from?
You need to put an else.
You think it's because I need an else? All right, let's try it out. Maybe that's what it is.
I think. Is it because you have two equal signs in the not equals?
All right, maybe it's because I have two equal signs, right? Let's try that out. So type of is supposed to return the actual string itself, right? So you're saying to change that into a equal sign like this. All right.
Is it because you have an or instead of a double and in between? So
Go ahead.
so full name shouldn't be a string and last name shouldn't be a string. So either way, it's gonna fail. Or is it just
Yeah, so let's talk about that a little bit here. All right. All right. So this outer block here, oh wow, I did not know I was. All right, this should work. This outer block here is going to be our or statements. Right? Meaning that one or the other needs to be true. The inner block between them is going to be our and statement, meaning that both conditions need to be met in order to work. All right, so there we go. So I can see that I'm working through this. Maybe, but the issue is definitely here, right? It's in this if statement. So what would be a better way of writing this if statement? Can anybody help me out here? And so we know we want to evaluate first name. We also know we need to evaluate last name. But how do we evaluate these two?
Would it be if first name and last name are string, then return first name, last name?
Yeah, let's try that out. Let's see. Let's do if first name is, and actually we want type of here. So I'm just going to go ahead and make another cursor here. Let's do type of. And we're going to say this is equal to string. All right, so if they're equal to string, then we are good to go. All right, well, that got us a
Now
little...
the return statement's wrong.
Right, so now we're getting a little bit closer. Maybe we want this to be triple equals, right? Let's see. Interesting. So we're still getting a little bit of an issue.
Because it's backwards. Should we not put the return statement for first name, last name added together in the first if statement and then the other way around because we're receiving the other arguments?
Well, we're receiving 2 and 3 because we're returning 2 and 3 in the string literal.
Right. All
So
right.
it's passing the if case, or it's not passing the if case, therefore it's still returning 2 and 3.
All right, so this is going to be a good spot to utilize our playground here, right? So let's go into Node real quick. And let's say that I'm going to have a number variable be equal to 3. All right, and then I'm going to say let my num type be equal to type of, and I'm going to pass in num. All right, so now I have my num type. Well, now let's simply try to see what is going on here. I'm going to try to console.log my num type if it is equal to string because that's what we're evaluating, right? So it's giving me false. Okay, that's good. So now let's try a string here. Let's do console.log a string. A string. And let's evaluate if this type of is equal to a string. I'm still getting false. Interesting.
Are we not naming string correctly? Is it str instead of object string?
All right, let's try that. Let's see if we can do str. Well, it looks like str has to do with Python, but we can still try it out. Maybe we can do it here down below and see what it returns. So str is not defined. All
Can
right.
can we just
Okay.
directly see what the type of is? Just
Yeah.
like console logging.
A string. And it gives me back string.
Did we use the question mark to like the ternary to do comparisons earlier on?
I think. Don't use the full word string without a capital S,
Yeah.
because I think that turns it into a object, right? Or a constructor object.
All right, let's try it out. Let's see, string. Well, that didn't work. That's not what I wanted. Yeah, we're definitely going about this the wrong way, right? So let's try to clarify this a little bit more. So what if I'm not trying to evaluate the types? What if I just want to evaluate, or excuse me, what if I just want to evaluate the types, but not the content, all right? I don't want to do a triple equal sign here. So let's see, if I have a string and I run a double equals to an empty string, it looks like it gives me false, all right? But now what if I do this? So type of a string, we know that's going to return string. So what if I make that triple equals to string? Now we get true down below. Right?
Why are strings in quotes though?
Yeah, that's a great question. So why is string in quotes? And that's because of our type of operator here, right? So this is a great example as to like why it's important to console.log everything and see how everything works. We're utilizing that type of operator without truly understanding what it is that it's returning. So that type of is returning a representation of what the string is, or the data type that we're looking, but it's returning it as a string itself. Now, with that said, we can finally write our function here of first name being equal to string, or, and I'm sorry, that would be not equal to, I apologize. Oh, I think there was a question, go ahead.
It needs to be and.
You think so? Let's try it out.
Well, because both need to be.
But if one isn't, it doesn't matter.
Right.
All right. So let's try that out. I'm going to run that, get back my terminal, clear this whole playground here, and now let's run npm test. All right, it finally does it. All right, it's able to identify both of them. It looks like it passed. And just like someone mentioned, what if one of them was and the other one wasn't? All right, let's do, this was supposed to be Francisco. Oh, okay, well now it's failing. All right, we're getting Francisco coming back true. And it's not doing what I expected it to do. Okay, so now if we go back to example.js and we turn this into an OR operator and run our test, you can see 4 passed, and only one failed. All right. And now we're getting Francisco Avila failing. And at this point, now it's not intentional. I'm not sure why this one's failing. Let's see. Francisco Avila is not a string, or Francisco Avila is not a string. I see, because both of these are evaluating to false. So if both of these are evaluating to false, why is it not defaulting to that down below? Interesting.
Is it
Like-
because you have to put the type of before the L name?
There we go. And there it is. Now we got all 5 of our tests finally passing. All right. And now we just did some test-driven development to analyze a specific edge case for each of our functions. All right. That's great. Does anybody have any questions about test-driven development?
Yeah, so basically, this is essentially what coder by assessment was doing. So it checks for every test case scenario, right? And this is what it is. It's using test-driven cases to check our program functioning.
Exactly. Yes. And as we grow, we'll go from unit tests, which are just testing functions, to going into end-to-end tests and integration tests. Eventually, we'll learn how to create an entire site or an entire project that will have everything tested to ensure that none of our project breaks. All right. Go ahead, Erica.
Is there a way to, because these are all test cases that we're manually writing. Is there a way to like automate that?
A way to automate writing tests?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, I see, Connor, you're really eager for this one, so go ahead.
Yeah, so there is actually different levels of doing this. So level 1 for testing is like writing it the way that he was doing, where you do like test, the name of the test, and then like expect, and then the function to be, and then all that other stuff. That's like level 1. So level 2 would be doing what's called parameterizing it. So instead of actually manually going through and testing each one, you'd make a test case like list with all of the objects of the test cases. And like it would be like, okay, so the input is going to be this, the expected is going to be that, and then, oh, here's like a description of it for more details. And then you just have like a for loop and you just go through and test each one of those. So that's level 2. Level 3 is way more advanced. And I just learned this too. It's called property-based testing. Property-based testing is a little bit more advanced, but it generates a lot of random tests, like without you having to do anything. And it tests properties instead of specific test cases. I don't think we'll cover the 3rd level in this course, but level 2 is really good and I use it all the time.
Which is basically just like putting expect, blah, blah, blah to be, expect, blah, blah, blah to be, expect, blah, blah, blah to be, like a list of expects. Or like or an iteration of like the expect to be in a list.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So like instead of having like it is right here where you manually do like test, expect, it's just like you have a list of like test cases. Like the input is this, the output is supposed to be this, and here's my description of it. And then I just iterate through that, and I just do the expect for all of them. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah, I know it's like deep into the detail, but like even if it's random, it runs into the possibility of not like testing a case. And as humans, we may not figure out that we're not testing something. So is there a way to like ensure that we're testing enough to minimize the margin of error?
Yeah. So when it comes to that, and I'm sorry, Connor, to take over, it's just we're starting to run a little bit steep on time. So everybody knows, when you get into the actual workplace, you're gonna be given the majority of the tests that you really need to worry about. They're gonna be dictated towards you. And then not only that, there's also an entire team called the quality assurance team, the QA team, right? and that they will literally spend days and weeks trying to break whatever it is that you made. And it's their job to identify if there's something that you didn't think about whenever you wrote that code.
Yeah, I know. I worked as QA, and that's why I asked if there's a way to automate this, because human error sucks.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to get at. And the third level, which is way more advanced, it's probably outside the scope of this course. It's called property-based testing. So like, let's say you wanted to test the sort function. Like a property of sorting is like, okay, so if you have two elements, A and B, like A is going to be less than B for every element, or like less than or equal to B. So instead of manually like enumerating test cases, you would have a program that generates millions or like as many test cases as you want randomly. But if it fails, it will tell you the seed value and you can replicate it. But it's a little bit more advanced, and I don't think it's going to be covered in this course.
All right. Awesome. All right, everyone. So now that we learned so much about testing, how to manage the NPM project structure, let's go ahead and take a dive into skipping test. All right, and skipping test is pretty simple. All you need to do is add an X in front of it. Remember, describe our blocks of test, right? So if I put an X in front of a describe block, it's going to skip all of those tests within that describe block. All right, and there we can see only one. There was one test suite that was identified, which is what I expected, which is my file. But 4 tests were skipped, and only one of them was executed and passed. All right. Now, if I only want an individual test within my block to be skipped, I can run it this way, and only one test gets skipped. All you have to do is add an X to the beginning of that specific block, either the describe for an entire block of test or a test for an individual test. Does anyone have any questions regarding testing at this point?
My wife is QA and she says she finds devs leaving her comments all the time, like, how did you find that? Or, wow, well done. It's impressive what they could find after you feel like you've done all the tests you possibly can and somehow they find something.
Yeah. That's awesome. All right, everyone, let's go ahead and take a quick 5-minute break, and then we'll come back and I'll give everyone a quick demonstration over what the React environment looks like. The main purpose of that is just to show you the why we're learning all of this. So currently right now it is 4:38. Let's come back at 4:43 and we'll see that quick demo. Thank you so much, everyone. All right, welcome back, everyone. Let's go ahead and take a look at why we learned all of this, right? This is all great, fantastic, but it seems pretty dry at the moment. What is this going to turn into? Like, what's in it for me as a student, right? Why am I learning all this information? Well, later on, we're gonna go ahead and learn something called Vite. And we're gonna have to create our React projects utilizing Vite for front-end frameworks. So please don't worry about what I'm actually doing here as of now. This is all purely demonstrational purposes. We're going to be covering in detail how to do, how to create a project and why you should choose things here. But I'm going to change directory into this example directory. And let's take a look at it real quick. Well, this example directory, I just initiated this project, and you can see that it already came with a lot of things, right? So it comes with this vconfig, a README that I didn't even create, a massive package.json that already has some dependencies along with some scripts. This is all information that we got an introductory level to today. We'll be talking about index.html and how that can talk with JavaScript over the next couple of weeks. And we have also covered a little bit about how exactly we build these functions and specify return statements. So again, this code may seem a little bit overwhelming or out of whack right now, but with everything that we got an introductory course to, we're gonna learn how to be able to, one, install our project, which might take a little bit longer than expected. And two, run a development server so that we can start creating things within our local computers and then eventually push them up to the web with our own creations. So this is Vite plus React. This is our end state and what we'll be working in, I believe in 2 weeks. We're going to start our front end module where we'll start working here within React. So that's the reason why we're learning everything we learned today. At this point, we're going to go ahead and start closing the lecture. Today we covered, oh, that's the wrong README. Again, the wrong README. Let me go ahead and close that down so I stop clicking on it. Today we covered primitive data types, variables, functions, complex data types, the ternary operator, loops, arrow functions, destructuring, the spread operator, exports. We did not cover pass by value and pass by reference. That was intentional. It will be covered. And then we covered Jest. We covered the NPM basics. What is a unit test? How to utilize Jest as a test runner, and how to handle the expect assertion library. And finally, we covered skipping tests. At this point, does anyone have any questions over any of the material that was covered today?
Is there anywhere I can go to practice this outside of, the assignments that you have? It seems like it's a practice thing, get used to using Jest and testing cases. I've never tested code using Jest before, so.
Yeah, as far as practicing Jest specifically, I can't think of a good area that you can practice it. If you just want to practice test-driven development, there's things like Leak Code or Code Wars that you can utilize. They'll specify problems for you, and I could probably demonstrate that here. I think I have Code Wars. Oh, apparently I don't. All right, so if I go to Code Wars, I click on it, I can log in. You get to choose the difficulty of what it is that you're going to be trying to achieve. You can try to train. There you could already see it has JavaScript selected. It'll give you different scenarios with different edge cases as to what you can do to make sure that your skills stay sharpened. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Of course. Gary?
Yeah, I was just wondering, so this is a lot of information. I know it's, that's what it was going to be, but like, what is the expectation for like retention of everything we learned today? Like, should I be able to do everything you just did like by tomorrow? Or like what would you expect?
Yeah, that's a great question. As far as the expectation isn't for you guys to master all of the material that gets taught the day of, right? That would be unrealistic. I think the expectation would be to have continuous progress. We don't ask for that continuous progress to be massive or completely overwhelming to the point where you have to disregard yourself or, the important people in your life, but rather for you to just chase and improve in a continuous process. I think a good measurement would be 70%, right? So 70% of what was taught today should be easily retained and replicated by tomorrow. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Thank you.
Of course. Any other questions? All right. If there are no other questions, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.